Hi, everyone. We'll be getting started here in just a moment. All right, well, we already got quite a few people rolling in, so we'll go ahead and get started here. So once again, thank you all for joining us, for what is our final CUSP seminar for the semester. We are really excited to have Dr. Caroline Baillie here today to speak with us. So Dr. Baillie is a professor within the Integrated Engineering Department and academic director of MESH, Masters of Engineering for Sustainability and Health at the University of San Diego. Dr. Baillie's main area of expertise is engineering as it relates to social justice. And in order to practice what she preaches, Baillie co-founded the not-for-profit Waste for Life organization in 2006 to socialize her materials engineering knowledge in support of vulnerable communities wishing to develop upcycled waste-based businesses. She also co-founded ESJP, the Engineering Social Justice and Peace Network, in 2004. Baillie's research considers socio-technical processes and systems which enhance social and environmental justice and educational systems that promote these. She brings lessons learned from these studies and practices into the classroom of all ages to facilitate the transformation to a more equitable and just future. In her spare time, Baillie runs forest-based retreats, a forest school program for children, and a forest school professional development program for teachers through the Standing People Together program of Waste for Life. Professor Baillie has published 27 scholarly books, an edited series of books on engineers, technology, and society, and over 200 book chapters, peer-reviewed journal, and conference papers. And with that, Professor Baillie will be speaking to us today on engineering and social justice, what it is, what is it not, and what does it look like in practice? So join me in welcoming Professor Baillie.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's a bit of a mouthy title, isn't it? Apologies for that. So it's always nice to start with who we are. Indigenous people do this so much better than I think well, I can speak for myself, we British people, we white people. So I come from the UK. I am originally a materials engineer, and I kind of collect disciplines all throughout as I ask questions. So I am the absolute expert of nothing. So as some of the PhD students I've spoken to this morning will recognize, but I ask really difficult questions, and it tends to produce curious results. So I'm going to take you through some of the things that I've been thinking about in relation to engineering social justice, and I hope that it will help you kind of position some of your own thoughts. And I want to also just acknowledge all of the different traditions and cultures and ways of thinking that I'm learning from, that I won't have time to really go into detail with. I'm also sitting on Lenape land as I speak, because I'm based in New York right now, but the University of San Diego is, of course, on Kumeyaay territory, not that you would necessarily know that. So what is social justice and engineering? What isn't it? And what does it look like in practice? So what I'm going to do is start with the idea of values. Probably, who's read this book? Let's have a show of hands. Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. It's probably kind of ages us a bit, but the idea of Persig's book was a motorcycle journey, but it was also about values. And one of the quotes in his book, quality and values, I'm just moving my photographs. Quality and values create the subjects and objects of the world, facts don't really exist until value has created them. If your values are rigid, you can't really learn new facts. So it just is a way of introduction. And a lot of people who study in the areas of science and technology studies, philosophy of science, and so on are very well aware that science and engineering is socially constructed, that science and engineering can actually have an impact on society just as much as society has an impact on what we create and how we create it. And the underlying values and dominant paradigms are going to influence that. And so we have to really start to think about what we're doing and why we're doing it if we really want to be just in our systems. Some years back, I borrowed the ideas of a guy called Michael Adams, who'd done some work on values. And I created a study looking at the values of people doing engineering. And in short, this was the result. And this was across a broad range of different kinds of engineering in North America, so Canada and the United States. And it kind of broadly came to this nice quadrant table that we love in engineering, where we have those who kind of range in their values from valuing the profession of engineering the most, to those that value what they do in society the most. If you like, the ones on the left here are going to be those who are really interested in the technical challenges and do it for the profession. You know, we even talk about service in an institution, university institution. You talk about service, and it's actually professional service. It's how much we're serving the profession of engineering. And on the right hand side, it will be society. Whereas your other axis is more related to sort of ideals or idealism. You're driven by your values, your own kind of values, or your culture's values, versus the idea of conformity or authority. You're the sort of person that loves to be told what to do, you know, by your institution or by your government or what have you. And so, you know, strangely enough, there were not very many people that popped up in that bottom right quadrant. The ones who are idealistic and focused on society, those who might be interested in human social development, sustainability, climate change, etc. It sadly didn't appear that much in the study of what people were valuing. And this matters. I want to also go back to a very early piece of work that I did in as soon as after I started working as an engineering professor. I was in Australia in a mechanical engineering school, and I went into my first class, and I literally went in the bottom of an auditorium, a lecture theatre, and there were 200 students there, and there was this wall of faces, and I could not see a female. I couldn't see a female. What was really peculiar to me was that I kind of hadn't noticed that problem before, right? And here it was, really throwing it in my face. And so I started asking the question, why so few? Why are there so few women in engineering? I have no idea. I don't understand it. I ended up doing a thesis in a master's in higher education in my spare time because I wanted to ask this question. And one of the students in my study said this to me: I was very interested in what you had to say yesterday, and I came to thank you. I had no idea I could be myself in my profession. I thought I had to become someone else or I wouldn't fit in. I really hadn't considered that I could bring some of who I am into my work and that might be a good thing. So there was this whole notion that I have to live by somebody else's values. I have to be driven by engineering values or the profession's values or the institutions or the academic values. But where am I in all of this? And of course, this is why we've designed the world that we have, because we've left all of those beautiful values out of the equation. So others have studied this kind of question of why so few. And of course, I'm taking women in engineering as an example. And I know that we've got much more sophisticated about our understanding of sex and gender since these times. But as a female engineering professor, I have a position on this and I've experienced it. So it's easy for me to speak about it. So Schuster and Van Dyne back in the 80s did this study where, and it's really quite amusing if you think about, amusing in that kind of sick Monty Python-esque kind of a way as to why, the questions that people were asking. So pre-1960, wouldn't even notice women weren't in engineering. You go back through the textbooks. I was once asked to review a history of engineering, and mechanical engineering in Canada, a book about it. And there was no question. Nobody was saying, oh, look, there's no women, wonder why. People weren't even asking that question. And then, of course, it's like, oh, where are they? Where are all the women? What should we do? So, and then it's like, oh, poor women. I was explaining to some of the PhD students in my pre-meeting something that happened to me, which is that, I was always, everybody wanted to give me mentors to sort of help me because I was this poor thing that needed help. When I didn't want their help, because guess what they were going to do? They were going to turn me into mini them. They were going to turn me into somebody that was more patriarchal than the men. Thank you very much. No, I did not want that. So how did I become me? How did I understand what my values were? How can I do this? And how can I help my students do this? And so we move through the years. And of course, we would hope that what we want is a kind of a balance, which is a transformation of what we currently have to reflect the values of those who are in it. So that really is a diverse environment. It's not about squishing people into the mold. And unfortunately, far too much of what people call social justice or equity today is about making people like the ones who are in power and assimilating into a system where everybody looks the same and they look all rather like that person over there, which has nothing to do with the original person's values. When I first went to Canada as a professor of engineering education, I went up to a lot of women in power and I was asking them different questions related to social justice and engineering. And many of them said to me, oh, I used to ask those questions, but then I became an administrator. It's really hard, True. It is really hard, but they're reinforcing those problematic values unless they can question them. So at that time in Canada, as a professor new to the country, and it always helps when you change country or you change context a little bit. It helps because you ask different questions. You look around you and you say, oh, that's probably the same in my country as well, but I never really thought about it before. Like me walking into that room with a wall full of males. I was in Canada saying, I don't really understand why you all are completely obsessed with profit. Why do I have to make a profit as an engineer? I don't understand. Why do I have to do that? And they would say, oh, you're so naive. Of course you have to make a profit. That's what we engineers do. And I'm like, oh, really? I didn't know that. And so that was really a shock to the system. I had gone to Canada. They was like, oh, the social welfare mecca of the world. I'm going to really enjoy the social justice. And yet I literally had venture capitalists knocking on my door saying, we would love to give you this money to do this thing, which I completely didn't agree with. And when I turned them down, they'd say, what? You don't want money? I actually had my dean say to me, you mean you won't take $1 million from these people? And say, well, no, why would I do that? It's unethical and I don't agree with their values. So it's very curious. It's very, very hard to stay with what you value. So I formed Engineering, Social Justice and Peace at this time by asking a lot of difficult questions of a lot of people. And I would ask people, what would engineering look like if it focused on people and what they need? And we're talking, all people here, not just the middle-class white men. And what would that look like if it wasn't focused on profit first? So, yeah, we've got to be able to afford it, but maybe we actually do different engineering. Maybe we do different things. Maybe we solve different challenges. And it sounds like a naive question, and in many ways it is. But naive questions, as you know from children, are the best ones because they start to make you think differently. And so we held our first conference in 2004 around that kind of questioning. And at that time, it was very few engineers and a lot of social scientists, and it's kind of gone the other way over the years. So I won't go through all of these, but if you go to the website of Engineering, Social Justice and Peace, you can see what the commitments of the sort of core group of us that started this going in that time period. And I just wanted to pick out this one. We committed to envisioning and practicing engineering in ways that extend social justice and peace by understanding how technology and society are co-constructed, identifying and dismantling specific occurrences of injustice, and collaborating with communities facing those specific structures of injustice and devising technologies that address that. So it's a moving target, and injustice in many forms, reflexivity, praxis, translating value and ideas into practice. And so these are the sort of generic goals, and they're very wordy, and they're on the website. But what was very important for us was to try to stay true to these initial questions. Whenever anybody starts what might in other language be called a movement, there are always those, again, who try to come in and kind of change that and assimilate you into the dominant paradigms. And you can sound very exclusive if you say, oh, no, that's not what we're about. We're not about that. We're not about that. We're not about that. You can sound like, well, you don't want to be a member of my club. Thanks. And yet, at the same time, you want to reach out to anybody and everybody who's asking these questions. We didn't have any answers. We just had questions. So what is it today? This area of engineering and social justice, it's a field of research. People have been doing a lot of research over many years now in different areas. And of course, this is very broad, many different areas of engineering and different definitions of social justice. It's a lens through which to see engineering practice. It is an area of engineering education. So we teach this area different ways in different places in different parts of the world. It's a commitment, it's a design path and process. And it is, explicitly questioning the dominant paradigm of growth and capitalism, which requires certain things of us and of the world, and is ecologically unsustainable. And of course, that one is the hardest one for a lot of people to swallow. And so what do we mean by engineering social justice? And I use the word, I'm talking from the perspective of ESJP, but I probably should say, what do I mean by social justice? Because we're all very different. And I certainly draw on multiple critical theories. So critical theories, engineering, people often think critical thinking is just kind of logical, rational thinking. But when I mean it, I'm talking about those critical theories coming from Frankfurt and beyond, Marxist traditions, ecological justice, faith rights, and of course the more kind of traditional kind of critical theories, and since the ones that have come out since, most people have been recently talking about critical race theory, but there are plenty of other critical theories as well that we draw on to understand what we are doing. And there's no one definition of social justice. So what I'm going to do now is take you through a series of other frameworks that are often confused with social justice and engineering. And I hope this is helpful. Certainly when we were talking in the previous discussion with some of the PhD students attached to your center, we were questioning what people meant by fairness and what people meant by just. Because, of course, the way that we define those things and the way that we are influenced will mean that we apply that in different ways, and what results is going to be different. So it's worth questioning. And I've often been told that ethics is the same as justice. And I was invited one time to the National Academy of Engineers, who held a meeting on ethics. This was some time ago, probably in the 90s. And you know, those of us talking about social justice at that time were called communists. I'm certainly, you know, I'm not against being called a socialist, but I'm certainly not a communist. So it was completely inaccurate. And being interested in social justice does not mean that you're a communist. And so there was this American paranoia that was fascinating to me, coming from England, where if you talked about social justice, nobody called you a communist. So that was really curious. But I was also very interested in the way that ethics codes are used. And a lot of people would teach ethics and then say, well, we've addressed the social justice question by teaching ethics. And yet they would, you know, they would draw on the Greek philosophers, and they would talk about virtue ethics and duty ethics and other kinds of ethics ways and frameworks. And they would bring out the ethics codes, and all the different engineering areas has its own code. And as you know, major corporations have codes of conduct and various other things. And of course, what frames them comes from somewhere. And I wrote a paper one time with Michael Levine, who's a philosopher. And what we say in that paper, where we're comparing kind of ethics and social justice in relation to engineering, is that, you know, the engineering professor as a whole takes major aspects of the dominant discourse for granted. We mean the socioeconomic system that we kind of grown up with, at least most people under 40 have. And this discourse is intrinsically linked to corresponding ingrained mode of practice and serves to reify such practice. And what do we mean by that? So this idea of profit is a very simple one, but it's an obvious one to talk about. And I simplify things because I think it's important to do so. So if I sound too basic for some of the more eloquent kind of arguments, I am. And I think it's really important to be simple in the way that you try and describe things. Because what happens is when we use a term that we think explains something and we don't explain what we mean by it, often we do have that appropriation happening, that people will take that term and think that you mean the same as them. And when it comes to the dominant paradigm, that everything in our common sense is connected to growth and profit and success and status and power, and then we're going to interpret it through those unless somebody says differently. And so a lot of the engineering ethics codes are really fascinating. They'll talk about listening to community. So if you're going to put a mine somewhere, then you must listen to the community next to the mine site to see if they'd like it or not. But it doesn't say you've got to do anything about it. You just listen to them. And so, of course, we have lots of community engagement practices and processes so that we can listen to them and then just do it anyway. So the ethic code doesn't do us any good in that circumstance. Okay. So another area is in humanitarian engineering. A lot of people use that term. And you know, it's a really necessary area. Of course, it works with, you know, areas in the global South, in areas where you know, there are floods, and in areas where there are droughts and other so-called natural disasters, where we have, you know, a really important role to serve those communities. So I'm not questioning that at all. But I just wanted to bring up the question of who benefits and who pays, and particularly related to engineering students who get involved with what's known as humanitarian engineering. And Mitchum and Munoz here talk about the challenge being to carefully consider our understandings of what we are about. Why are we doing it? Are we doing it because it will be a really interesting thing for us to do? Because it sounds cool. We can tell our friends and they think we're cool. We get something on our resume, so we get employed. And what tends to happen is that the communities often suffer more than they benefit. So we used Ursula Franklin's framing of who pays and who benefits when any development or any design is either started or implemented. We went and did a study of a particular engineering intervention in Ghana. And the community there were very honest with us and said, you know, well, you kind of don't understand our culture. Not us, but the people that had done these engineering interventions. You create dependency. We end up thinking that you're going to care for us. We kind of adjust our cultural practices. And there's this unequal power relationship. What does this sound like? Sounds like colonialism, doesn't it? And so we have more of the same. The white savior on the horse going over and saving everybody. And Ivan Illich would say, you know, to hell with good intentions. This isn't good enough. And too much of what people couch as justice is actually what I would consider charity. Charity is necessary, but not sufficient to make a transformation such that charity is no longer necessary. Okay, so we have to really consider why we're doing it and who benefits and who pays. Another area that we often get confused with is corporate social responsibility. And, you know, it's generated as a way of doing good, of addressing some of the ills within a corporation. And of course, there can be some benefits of that. But I'm here taking an example of mining. So I've done a lot of work on the impact of mining. And a guy that we've interviewed a lot, who is, his role is kind of community engagement, global practice and he used to work for Rio Tinto mine. And he's very eloquent on this topic, and I really appreciate his time with us in helping us to see what it's like working inside the sector. He says, we're coming in and we're saying we want to develop this major mine. We want to build this great big minerals processing facility. And it's almost inevitably in a frontier, by the way. You know, I mean, major urban first world social communities don't want a mine. London's not going to host a mine, nor's Melbourne, nor's New York, nor's Perth, for that matter. So as a matter of sort of by definition, we're always going to be working at the frontier. And we're always saying to people, we're going to build this plant, this facility, this mine. It's going to rapidly change and affect your social and physical landscape forever. And so there's this power play. And I actually ended up training as an alternate dispute resolution negotiator in order to understand how mining community engagement processes happen. And of course, the mining company puts the negotiation in terms that the community would understand. They do interest-based negotiation. It's like, I'm going to frame the mine coming in your interests. I'm going to tell you how much you're going to benefit from it. And they will go to great depths to understand the culture and the needs of the local community in order to frame it in that way, which one might say is really great. However, the community do not have the benefit the other way. They do not have the power. They don't have the interest. They don't know what the interests of the company are. They don't get that. They can't really read the 600-page environmental impact assessment. So they're at a disadvantage. And the people that we spoke to on the ground in Peru, for example, near to mine sites there that we were studying, told us what we really need is a radio program in a Quechua language which explains in simple terms exactly what is going to happen over the next 10 years of that mine site development, because nobody tells us that. And corporate social responsibility comes in here because it's used as leverage. We are going to give you schools and hospitals, and manipulates the communities into believing that it's a great deal, but they don't mention that they're going to ruin the ecosystem, they're going to ruin the rivers, that their family and their animals are going to get sick. Maxima Chaupa, whose picture is here, we spent a lot of time interviewing her and others like her who stand up for the rights of their own land. She was being moved on by the mining company. Her children were regularly beaten up. People that we spoke to many times being tortured in the name of the mining companies. And the mining companies say that they can't do anything about it. They're not in control of the local mine managers. So the CEOs in London sit around discussing how terrible it is, but for some reason they can't control their own mine managers. Clearly, one would not in that case equate corporate social responsibility to social justice. A social justice perspective would support the rights of those minorities who claim their land and livelihoods are being destroyed. And in fact, what's interesting is there's something called free, prior, and informed consent, which you might have heard of. Free, prior, and informed consent is a labor organization, international labor organization law, which is brought in to support communities, indigenous communities in different countries when mining and other developments are coming about. And it's really fascinating to see exactly how this is used. So in Peru, for example, a law was passed that indigenous people were no longer called indigenous. They were just peasants. And because the International Labour Organization law of free, prior, and informed consent was only relevant to indigenous people, they could no longer have it applied to them. Another thing that happened in Colombia was that they made it illegal to have consent. The communities did not have the power of veto, even though one might imagine that free, prior, and informed consent meant that they could say yes or no. Apparently, they could never say no. So it's very interesting how these things are manipulated. And that's what social justice is about, rather than corporate social responsibility. So I wanted to kind of just give you those frameworks, because often it's so hard to understand what we mean by justice or fairness or ethics. And sometimes they all kind of blend into one when we haven't really been able to think about it too much. So I spent a lot of time worrying about this myself and thought, well, I'd better practice what I preach. What does it look like to be a materials engineer who does this kind of thing? And you know, it wasn't easy at all. And I still do not think that I do it very well. But my question was, you know, I'm a materials engineer. I do all this research and all of this technology. How can I share my knowledge with those that don't normally get access to it? And how can that knowledge shift power? And so as a materials engineer, what would that mean? And I had been in Cairo, where a community lives next to the city in a place called Makatom, and where about 25,000 people live, and they process the city's waste. They actually take all the recyclables off the landfill and they make money from it. And so you have individual families who are kind of recycling different kinds of materials. And when I visited there, I met some of those families, and they had no idea what they were doing. So they were making these kind of horrible materials that, you know, couldn't make much money. And then I was in Argentina, and I met a person who was collecting garbage and separating it and trying to sell it, but he didn't really know the difference between one type of plastic and another. I spent an hour with that guy, and his salary increased from $200 a month to $600 a month, just because I could explain to him how to separate polyethylene from polypropylene, from polyethylene terephthalate, PET soda bottles. My knowledge to him was income for his family. And so I kind of started to question this. So you heard this idea of socializing knowledge earlier. So I formed an organization with my now husband called Waste for Life, simply on the premise of what is waste for one person is life giving to another. And what's interesting about it is over the years, it's created a lot of projects for students of many different disciplines, but it's also created a lot of questions, because it sounds awfully like some of those kind of charitable humanitarian programs that I claim not to be doing. And so, you know, I'm very happy to have a discussion at the end, and also happy to kind of work out how it relates to your own work. Currently at the University of San Diego, I set up something called the Engineering Exchange for Social Justice on this premise of sharing and exchanging. And the idea of who is it that decides what is engineered and why. And so the idea is that we work with communities, with people who are not normally the ones in power, to decide what is it that we should be engineering? What is it that we should be creating? We don't just get those ideas from the company, from the military, or from the government. It's negotiated at that stage. And with that program, we're working at the moment with Waste for Life in Tijuana. But I wanted to give you a little backstory about Waste for Life so that you can kind of understand it, and then we'll stop for questions. So that's a picture, by the way, of the street in Tijuana where we work. And, you know, it's 20 miles away across the border from the University of San Diego. And our students cannot believe that this is very close to where they live. I mentioned, you know, that I was a materials engineer. My PhD was on composite materials, or reinforced plastic, which is one of the big sinners of the environmental movement. But, you know, when I went through, we weren't thinking about that. We didn't even have a class on recycling. And so what I work with is natural fiber composites which use, a composite is simply a reinforced plastic, and it uses whatever fibrous material is around in the waste stream wherever you are in the world. So it could be flax, sugarcane, agave, or it could be textiles, cardboard, paper, depending on whether you're in a city or in a rural environment. And the plastic is the plastic, whatever's in the waste stream. That happens to be a thermoplastic that can be melted. And we create all sorts of beautiful things. This is a tile, a roofing tile that we make from, this one is actually wood fiber, but we make all sorts of different materials. So the journey started in Lesotho in Southern Africa. We're always invited in. I don't sort of do the whole, I'm going to go work there because I feel like it. This was a PhD student of mine that wanted to work with waste in his country because he saw this in his neighborhood, just open dumping and burning of plastic waste. And in the community, you have these houses with kind of metal roofs, very hot, water kind of raining down from the ceiling when you cook inside in the winter. And what we did there, as you can see in the window, a beautiful picture of the agave plants that are in that neighborhood. And what we ended up using there was the fibrous material that is waste from the production of aloe gel, or the agave gel, which is, you know, similar to aloe gel, together with plastic bags so that we could make ceiling tiles to create insulation for the buildings. In Argentina, some of you may know there was a large economic crisis in 2001. caused by a government defaulting on debts. And all of the political, economic, business, and engineering leaders left the country. Most of the manufacturing, all the manufacturing plants and factories closed down. People who had a small amount of money in the banks just suddenly disappeared. And there were thousands and thousands and thousands of people on the streets trying to make a living by processing garbage. And what we wanted to do there was try to support those people from being scavengers to being manufacturers. And this is a power situation. So just very quickly, because I know I've got less time, we developed a piece of equipment that could do the same processing with heat and pressure as a normal kind of industrial piece, which might cost hundreds of thousands or million. This is for $1,000, depending on the labor cost. And interestingly, colleagues in engineering often say you don't do innovative work, and it's mostly because it's too cheap. It's too low cost. They made very beautiful domestic products, as well as things like trash cans and so on. And that is still going on today. What was interesting there was the way in which the community of waste pickers gained power by being involved in the system of waste in the city. They were a player that had a voice. It wasn't, as well as having some money. When we went to work in Sri Lanka some years later, my PhD student, who again invited us in, did a power study. And she looked at what she called the Wastescape and the dominant discourse of waste in the country and the role of the waste worker. And she says, not only is the informal waste worker knowledge unrecognized, there's a cultural resentment which positions informal waste workers as abject and reproduces inefficiencies through the unquestioned commitment to large scale projects. And so they would buy in these massive reprocessing factories from China and leave all of these other people completely out of the system. And so just, I haven't got time to go through this, but we did a large study using the kind of Foucault's discourse analysis and questioning this idea of the dominant ideology of waste as a crisis. Let's get rid of the waste, bring in the massive factory. All the profit from that goes to the Chinese company, and all of these people are still completely unemployed, and, you know, devastating things happening. And so waste as a crisis turns into waste as a resource. And that ideology is the really important shift that has now happened in Argentina and now happened in Sri Lanka. And our main impact from Waste for Life is this shift in an ideology of what waste can be, not just in working with the technology of making waste into a product. And just a final piece on Sri Lanka, the northern area where a lot of people have suffered from 30 years of civil war. They're reprocessing banana fiber from the stems of banana plants. It's a gorgeous material, which is quite translucent, as you can see, great for all sorts of products. They make notebooks. They get large commissions for these books. It brings them a lot of income. It uses up a lot of waste. They're now putting it into building materials as well. This is a small building with a roof, which is made from banana fiber, rice husk, and plastic bags. And interestingly, United Nations are putting in roofs into new buildings made from asbestos. So we're politely asking them to use these materials instead, to give money to the local, use up the waste, and not use asbestos. I haven't got time to go into this in detail, but I just wanted to share the way that we work with students is also on this exchange model. We're working with the Kumeyaay, who are traditional landowners across the border, Mexico and the United States, So we're working with all of these different cultures to understand and co-create what we mean by progress, so that when we are doing our work now in Tijuana, which is my current location for Waste for Life, we understand, we co-define and we co-create solutions with all of the players. It's not just Baillie's little group deciding what happens. And I think I will stop there so I can get some questions. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. I think you gave us a lot to think about and to process. And I, I'm sure it'll actually lead into quite an interesting discussion. So at this point, we are going to open up the floor for questions. You can feel free to raise your hand using kind of the virtual kind of hand raise, or otherwise kind of grab my attention. Folks are also welcome to put their questions in the chat box if you'd prefer to have your question read out loud. Would anyone like to get us started? All right, Harlampos, you have the floor.
Thank you, Professor Baillie, for the great presentation. I have a couple of questions, actually. The first one is, you mentioned corporate responsibility and the case with funding from mines. So I was wondering, and sorry, I have some interventions. And you mentioned how the mine companies would essentially have sort of a cost benefit analysis to their approach even to the people. So this is what the cost will be, and this is what we can bring to the table. So I wanted to dig a little bit deeper on this, and on your take. I think that when looking at quality of life, and maybe when looking at personal mission, and when looking at community level objectives, the cost benefit analysis doesn't align, or it doesn't suffice to just put on more money here and there, but there are other dimensions. Thank you.
Thank you. By the way, I've just noticed a few friends in the audience, so thanks for showing up. I think I can see Anne, Juan, David, Katie. Yeah, thanks for the question. That's a great question. And I would say, again, just like our notion of what's fairness, what's justice, where are we getting our ideas from? What's informing our cost benefit analysis? So I asked this question of who benefits and who pays. If you don't add the question who to that, you're not going to get anywhere. So whether it's social costs, environmental costs, economic costs, there are going to be winners and losers, and we need to question all of those. So if the company did an adequate cost benefit analysis and worked out, oh, we're getting all the profit and the locals are getting all the environmental costs, that would be a fair cost benefit analysis, but of course that doesn't happen.
Yeah, I was trying to understand if also the framework kind of goes beyond the fairness argument. Or it's just, we can put, maybe if we had a dollar value for the environmental cost, then we could put it in a model and run it and say, oh, then this is how much you should pay.
Well, I was trying to point out that the difference between a model where you would, maybe you would do an ethics kind of fairness analysis that would look at the country as a whole, and the majority, even if the corporate social responsibility was done well, and there's royalties that are not just being taken by the government, but they're being shared out, and that there is indeed a hospital and there is indeed a school and so on. One needs to still take into consideration, okay, so what happens when that company leaves? Who's going to pay for them then? Are they going to be worse off, et cetera, et cetera? So you have to take a time dimension in, but you also have to look at the 100 people that live adjacent to the mine. And for example, in the people that we've worked with who are being mistreated and victimized by in the name of the mining company in order to get them off their land, because that mine company has invested so much money, it is going to mine there. And in that case, fairness or sharing, distribution, whatever, according to the majority isn't going to function. I'm sorry, if they're going to torture one person, then that's a big no in my book. So it's very difficult to apply these kind of majority benefit type rules unless you put in a qualitative value judgment as well.
Thank you. They're hard questions.
All right, Ahmad, would you like to go next?
Yeah, so thanks a lot for the presentation. So I'm gonna be a bit pragmatic here as an engineer, and yeah, I'm gonna ask a bit of a difficult question. So you've mentioned that profit as a reward is basically the main paradigm in a capitalist system, and I was asking how can we like incorporate a different kind of reward into our system? So in technology and engineering as a problem, how can we embed this as an engineering problem actually into creating more just systems? Sorry.
I'm sorry, the question is how can we put in another word instead of profit? Is that what
No, yeah, reward, a different kind of reward. So basically you mentioned that public good and fairness and wellness is definitely all kind of things that we all care about, right? And we manufacture systems which basically, as an engineers, which can in return sometimes work against us, right? And yeah, maybe we can look differently at the problem and try to incorporate different kind of reward in the end in those systems such that they work for the public good. In the end.
Reward or a word? I'm sorry, not quite catching it.
Reward.
A reward. Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay. So we mean what's in it for the company? Is that what we're asking here?
No. Like as for public
what's
good, as a token, as a like for like caring for doing something which is not related to profit, right? Like wellness as a reward, for example, or I don't know.
As an outcome, I'm not quite sure I understand the reward.
Right.
I think it's important to unpack what you mean by reward. To whom?
Right, as an outcome.
As an outcome. Okay, right, thanks. Well, I guess that's why I started using the term social justice. And Katie, who's here somewhere as well, is one of our also co-founders. And I asked that question about social justice because it kind of gave you a different framing. You could, I like socializing as well, but that's less, it's kind of can get away with too much. And if your understanding of social justice incorporates what I said, multiple different justice traditions and questions of systemic oppressions and so on, you're going to be able to question your designs and your development. So if your outcome is social justice, along with the technological ones that you want. So you want a strong material, you want a tough material, you want social and ecological justice. But if you think about design or development, I mean, George Catalano actually put this term of social justice into his design cycle. So you go around the whole thing as, okay, you're going to define the problem, you're going to generate ideas, you're going to work out what you're going to do, you're going to design it, you're going to do all your technological stuff. And then at the end, you're going to ask your question, does it enhance justice in the world? No? Okay, I'm going to start again. I'm going to iterate around again. And I think, it can be as simple as that, or as simple as Ursula Franklin's question of who benefits and who pays. If you ask this question in your design cycle, in your development cycle, then you're going to have a different outcome in that case.
All right. We do have some questions being written in here in the chat box. Excuse me. So the first question, EY has listed social license as the top risk to mining again this year. Do you expect that increased expectations for ESG reporting and the associated risk to finances for poor social performance will eventually make a difference? And do you see the shared value paradigm as aligning with the goals of social justice?
Hi, Anne. I want you to speak your question, please, because you're speaking from a very inside mining perspective, and so you're going to have to clarify what you mean by certain terms, I think. So what is your main question? Oh, I can't hear you.
Yeah, I'll confess. I'm Caroline's former master's student, and I'm now employed as an assistant mining professor, where my job is to be critical of mining and to encourage our students to be critical, to be culturally aware, and to work towards a shared value paradigm. My question is that going to be a sufficient way of achieving social justice in the mining industry? You know, I mean, the shared value paradigm asks that the metric is anything that we do should leave a community better off by metrics that the community creates, not the metrics we would use, but the metrics of the community. So that's part of the question. And the other part of the question is, now that companies are required to report on their performance against environmental, social, and governance indicators, I'm wondering, Caroline, do you think that this increased reporting will help to drag companies kicking and screaming towards better inclusion of the interests of the communities where we work?
I would say it might do a little bit of good, but whilst we still have, it does not going to do much for ecological justice, is it? Mining isn't a great thing to do in that regard. And yet we do have to find alternative ways of doing things before we can stop mining all the mining that we're doing. So that's a complicated question. And then also, do policies and regulations help? Absolutely, they do. I don't know the particular ones that you're speaking about, but yes, government policies and taxations and other systems obviously also help to regulate what goes on, but one has to also ensure that how those things are implemented and evaluated are done in a just way. So for example, as I said, communities are often hoodwinked into getting the mine under perfectly great shared value propositions, and yet they have no idea what they're talking about. Also, often mining communities will send the men along to the meetings and leave the women at home, and the men will say yes because they think they want a job. And the women would have said no. So, I mean, that's just a very blanket one, but I've worked a lot with those kinds of organizations where the women are fighting and their husbands are staying very silent. So thanks for that. And Celeste, nice to see you here. I agree.
Well,
I think we've run out of time, haven't we, John?
Yeah, I was going to say, we can end on that note because unfortunately, this has been a great discussion. But I want to thank you again for joining us, and we encourage all the others folks in attendance still to join me in a round of applause. And yeah, thank you all for coming, and we look forward to seeing you all in our next seminars as we get started again back in the next semester. So.
And great, thank you so much for having me, and thanks for inviting me, Ludovic. And it's just wonderful. I'd love to have more involvement with your organization and attend some of your seminars, because I think what you're doing is it looks fascinating, and I think we should be doing more of it.
Well, great, it's fantastic. Thank you again.
All right, see you in the other Zoom room soon.
Okay, bye-bye, everybody.